He was just diving under an old city bridge, cleaning trash from the river. But one day his tool struck smooth metal where there should have been nothing but silt and concrete. Under the bridge support, he found a strange rocket-shaped object bolted tightly to the structure. They lifted it to the surface and opened it. And what they saw terrified everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. He never thought of himself as a hero. That word belonged to movies, to men in uniforms and polished boots, to people whose names ended up carved into plaques or whispered in news broadcasts. He was just a man who refused to look away from the place everyone else had decided was not worth seeing. His apartment stood 3 blocks from the river, in a narrow brick building that leaned ever so slightly toward the street, as if tired of holding itself upright after so many decades. The neighborhood was not dangerous in the way television liked to portray it, with sirens and shouting every hour, but it carried a quiet fatigue that sank into the bones. Most of the people who lived there worked hard, went home exhausted, and learned to lower their eyes when the city offered them yet another reminder of what had been neglected. The river was one of those reminders. It cut through the district like an old scar, its surface brown and sluggish, carrying a lifetime of bottles, bags, rotting wood, and the occasional glimmer of something metal that had no business being in the water. He had grown up playing on those banks as a child when the river still seemed like something alive. His mother used to scold him when he came home soaked to the knees, pockets full of smooth stones he claimed were treasures. He remembered the smell of wet reeds and the way the water reflected the orange of the setting sun, making the world feel briefly warm even in autumn. Over the years, the colors faded, not just in his memory, but in reality. The reeds died, the banks hardened under concrete. The water turned opaque, like a blind eye that refused to show what lay beneath. It was after a string of bad decisions in his early 20s that he discovered diving. He did not tell people the full story. He would say he needed a new hobby or that he wanted to stay in shape, but the truth was uglier and more honest. He had been drifting, angry at the world for reasons he could not clearly name, and close to losing himself in habits that offered comfort only for a few hours at a time. A coworker mentioned a cheap introductory scuba course at a rundown recreation center by the docks. He signed up without much thought, expecting little more than a distraction. The first time he sank beneath the surface, the river closed around him like a heavy curtain. There was no cinematic beauty in it. The water was cold and dense, pressing against his mask, swallowing the light from his torch after just a few feet. Yet, in that darkness, he felt something he had not felt in years, a sense of focus so intense that the rest of his life faded away. There was no room for regret or resentment down there, only the steady rhythm of his breathing and the careful movements that kept him from stirring up clouds of silt. When he surfaced that day, coughing and shivering on the dock, he knew he had found something that anchored him. At first, he dove simply to explore. He followed the pylons of the bridge like a blind man tracing the grooves of a familiar wall, mapping the underwater world in his mind. He found shopping carts tangled in weeds, rusted bicycles fused to the mud, and once the twisted frame of a motorcycle that must have gone missing years earlier. It was when he tried to pull a broken chair free from the riverbed and cut his glove on a shard of glass that the idea of cleaning up occurred to him. It was absurdly simple. If he was going to be down there anyway, why not bring something back with him? He started with a few heavy-duty bags strapped to a harness. On the first day, he emerged with nothing but plastic bottles and soggy cardboard. The second day, he dragged up a tire, its rubber blackened by decades underwater. Passers-by stopped to watch, some with curiosity, others with a polite distance as if unsure whether he was admirable or unhinged. He posted a short clip on his social media account that evening, showing the pile of trash he had removed, and went to sleep without checking how many people had seen it. Within weeks, the comments began to appear. Strangers thanked him. A teacher from a school upriver asked if she could show his videos to her class. Someone mailed him a new pair of gloves after he mentioned in passing that his were falling apart. He found himself returning to the river more often, not out of obligation, but out of a growing sense that what he did mattered, even if only to a handful of people who had decided to care. The bridge became the center of his efforts. It was a hulking concrete structure built in the late 70s, when the city believed that cars were the future and everything else could bend to their will. 6 lanes of traffic thundered across it day and night, the vibration never ceasing long enough for the metal bones of the bridge to rest. From above it looked solid and permanent, but below the surface it told a different story. The pylons were scarred and pitted, their edges softened by years of current and debris. Around each one, the river formed swirling pockets where trash collected like sediment in a forgotten organ. He learned those pockets by heart. There was the one on the eastern side of the 3rd pylon, where old fishing lines wrapped themselves around anything foolish enough to drift close. There was the shallow trench under the 4th pylon, where bottles clustered in such numbers that they rang softly against each other when the current shifted. And there was the dark hollow beneath the central span, where the water moved unpredictably, sometimes tugging at his fins with enough force to make him grip the concrete and wait it out. Preparation became a ritual. He would lay out his gear on a faded tarp by the river, checking each piece with the methodical care of someone who had learned the hard way how quickly a small oversight could become lethal. The tanks were tested and retested, the regulator purged until the hiss of escaping air sounded clean. His knife hung from his leg in case he became entangled in wire or netting, and a thick rope ran from his harness to a metal stake driven deep into the soil on the bank. A volunteer would hold the free end, their presence a thin line of reassurance connecting him to the world above. Once submerged, the river erased the city. The roar of traffic softened into a distant tremor, felt more in his chest than heard through his ears. The smell of oil and garbage on the surface gave way to the metallic tang of cold water filtered through his mouthpiece. His torch carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing the ghostly outlines of objects long abandoned. Sometimes he would imagine the lives they once belonged to, a child losing a toy, a mechanic dropping a tool, a driver panicking as his car slid from the road into the water. Those thoughts never lingered long. Down there, imagination was a luxury he could not afford. He kept a small notebook in a waterproof pouch and sketched crude maps of the areas he cleaned, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he wanted to see progress. Each square he crossed off was proof that the river was not entirely beyond saving. Still, as the months went by, he began to notice things that did not fit the pattern of neglect he had come to expect. One afternoon, he found a length of heavy industrial cable coiled neatly between 2 rocks. It was not tangled or frayed like the fishing lines he usually cut away, but clean, as if it had been placed there intentionally. Another time he discovered the ends of thick plastic ties, their surfaces unscuffed, lying in a cluster near a pylon that had no reason to host them. He mentioned these oddities in a video, half joking that the river had a secret life of its own, and laughed it off when viewers speculated wildly in the comments. Yet the feeling lingered. He had come to know the language of trash, the way random debris arranged itself when left to the mercy of water and gravity. What he was seeing now spoke a different dialect, one of order rather than chaos. It made him uneasy in a way he could not fully articulate. The river had always been a dumping ground, but dumping was sloppy by nature. This was not sloppy. The morning the storm rolled in, he stood on the bank longer than usual, watching the sky bruise itself into darker shades of gray. Rain hammered the water upstream, swelling the river and turning its surface into a mosaic of ripples that caught and broke the light. He considered postponing the dive, but the thought of what the floodwaters would carry into his carefully mapped sectors tipped the balance. He pulled on his suit, nodded to the volunteer holding his rope, and stepped into the current. As he descended, the world grew thicker. The storm had churned the river into a dense soup of silt and leaves, reducing visibility to little more than the reach of his outstretched hand. He followed the familiar path to the central span, counting his kicks, feeling the tug of the current against his calves. When he reached the base of the third pylon and began clearing away a mat of weeds, his scraper met resistance that was neither mud nor stone. At first, he assumed it was another piece of rebar, a common find under the bridge. He brushed away the silt and felt a smooth, cold surface beneath his glove. It was too uniform, too deliberate. He angled his torch closer, the beam dissolving into a pale haze inches from the object, but the outline that emerged was unmistakably round. He worked slowly, heart beating louder in his ears than the rush of water. With each movement, more of the shape revealed itself, a long cylinder nestled against the underside of a metal beam. His fingers traced its curve, noting the absence of the jagged corrosion that covered everything else down there. When he followed the body of the object toward its attachment points, his breath caught. Heavy clamps encircled the cylinder, biting into the beam with a firmness that spoke of tools and intention. These were not the remnants of some forgotten construction project. They were fresh enough that the edges still gleamed faintly under the grime. A smear of grease floated free when he brushed against one, drifting away in an oily ribbon. A warning flared in his mind, sharp and undeniable. He had seen enough war documentaries to know the silhouette of something meant to be hidden, meant to be feared. The shape was wrong for a part of the bridge, wrong for any piece of trash he had ever encountered. It sat there like a parasite, feeding on the invisibility granted by the river and the indifference of the city above. He pulled back, careful not to disturb it further, and forced himself to note every detail he could. The angle of the beam, the depth on his gauge, the way the current bent around the object as if acknowledging its presence. His training told him to stay calm, to finish the task at hand, but instinct overruled discipline. This was not something he could bag and haul to the surface with a triumphant grin for his viewers. The ascent felt longer than usual. The water pressed in around him, suddenly hostile, each shadow hinting at dangers he had ignored for months. When his head broke the surface, the rain stung his face like needles. He ripped off his mask and sucked in the damp air, the noise of traffic crashing back into his senses. The volunteer on the bank took one look at his expression and let the rope slacken. He did not need to speak for them to understand that something had changed. As he stripped off his gloves with trembling fingers, he glanced back at the dark water beneath the bridge, trying to reconcile the peaceful act of cleaning trash with the realization that beneath his feet, hidden in the blind spot of a sleeping city, something else had been waiting all along. The rain did not let up after he climbed out of the river. It poured steadily, turning the dirt path by the bank into a slick ribbon of mud, yet he barely felt it. His hands shook as he wrapped his wetsuit around his waist, replaying the image in his mind again and again, the smooth curve of metal where no smooth metal had any right to be. The volunteer kept asking questions, but he waved them off, pacing a short circle like a man who had misplaced something precious. What he had found did not feel like garbage, and it did not feel like a forgotten relic either. It felt deliberate, like the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that someone else had started long before he arrived. He forced himself to slow down and think in the way diving had taught him to think. Panic was as dangerous on land as it was underwater. He replayed the sequence of the dive, reconstructing the moment his scraper had met resistance, the precise position of his body relative to the pylon, the depth indicated by his gauge when he leaned closer to investigate. He knew that if he was going to explain this to anyone, the details would matter. He also knew that his reputation as a careful, methodical cleaner was the only thing standing between him and being dismissed as an alarmist who had watched too many movies. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded steadier than he felt. He described the object as accurately as possible, not reaching for dramatic language, but letting the facts speak for themselves. It was long, perhaps 6 feet from end to end, and thick enough that he could not encircle it with his hands. Its surface was smooth in a way that suggested industrial fabrication rather than decay, and the clamps holding it to the beam were heavy enough that he doubted he could have loosened them even with a wrench. The volunteer listened, eyes widening with each detail, and for a moment they stood together under the bridge, 2 small figures dwarfed by concrete and rain, trying to imagine what kind of person would bolt something like that into the river and walk away. His phone was still in the dry bag when he retrieved it, the screen lighting up with missed notifications from viewers who had been waiting for his usual post-dive update. He ignored them and scrolled instead to the number he had saved months earlier, after a close call with a submerged shopping cart had nearly pinned him to the riverbed. It belonged to a harbor master who had once thanked him for alerting the authorities about a hazard to small boats. He hesitated only a moment before pressing call. Explaining the situation over the phone was harder than he expected. Without the image in front of him, the words sounded hollow, like he was describing something he had dreamed. The harbor master asked him to repeat himself more than once, his tone polite but tinged with disbelief. He did not raise his voice or accuse anyone of incompetence. He simply went over the details again, grounding each sentence in the physical reality he had touched with his own hands. When the man on the other end finally said he would send a patrol to take a look, relief washed over him so suddenly that he had to sit down on the wet concrete ledge to keep his legs from buckling. The wait felt endless. The rain softened into a mist, and the bridge above resumed its relentless hum as if nothing unusual were happening beneath it. He watched the river with a new awareness now, seeing not just floating trash but the dark volume of water that concealed secrets. Every few minutes, he caught himself imagining the cylinder breaking free, drifting silently downstream, or worse, rupturing and unleashing something toxic into the current. Each scenario fed the knot tightening in his chest. When the first police cruiser pulled up, its lights scattering blue across the slick asphalt, he stood so quickly that his knee cracked against the railing. The officers approached with the casual caution reserved for complaints that rarely amounted to anything more than a nuisance. They asked him to show them where he had been diving, and he pointed to the central pylon, struggling to translate 3-dimensional underwater space into language that made sense on land. They peered into the murky water, as if expecting to see the object from the surface, then glanced at each other. He could feel their skepticism pressing against him like a physical force. He described the clamps again, the way the metal had gleamed beneath the silt, and something in his insistence must have registered because one of them radioed for a supervisor. It did not take long for the mood to change. The supervisor arrived with a pair of city maintenance divers, men who moved with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to emergencies. They listened to his account without interrupting, then began unloading equipment from the back of their truck. Traffic was slowed, cones sprouting along the bridge like a sudden outbreak of color, and bystanders gathered behind the tape that the officers stretched across the path. He stayed close, answering questions, sketching the approximate location on a scrap of paper, pointing to landmarks that only made sense to someone who had spent hours memorizing the underbelly of the bridge. The maintenance divers descended into the river with a competence that reassured him even as it deepened his dread. He knew how unforgiving that water could be. When they surfaced, their faces were grim. One of them removed his mask and shook his head slowly, not in denial but in confirmation. There was something there, exactly where he had said it would be, and it did not belong to the bridge. The supervisor's radio crackled with instructions, and within minutes the scale of the response expanded beyond anything he had anticipated. More vehicles arrived, unmarked vans and trucks bearing logos he did not recognize. A portable command post materialized near the base of the bridge, its walls snapping into place with mechanical precision. The bridge was closed entirely now, the flow of cars diverted, drivers craning their necks to glimpse the disturbance that had stolen their commute. Reporters appeared as if summoned by the scent of uncertainty, their cameras trained on the water, eager for a story that had not yet revealed itself. Professional divers took over, their suits darker, their equipment bristling with instruments he had only ever seen in online forums. They descended in pairs, communicating through systems that allowed them to relay what they saw in real time. He was ushered back by an officer who asked him gently to stay behind the line, but his eyes never left the river. Hours passed in a blur of movement. He caught fragments of conversation about weight estimates and structural analysis, about the need to stabilize the object before attempting to remove it. Someone mentioned the possibility of it being inert. Another warned that nothing attached so carefully could be assumed harmless. He felt like an outsider in his own discovery, watching professionals navigate a world he had stumbled into by accident. As dusk settled, portable lights bathed the scene in an artificial glow, turning the bridge into a stage set for an invisible drama. He learned that the object was heavier than it looked, dense enough to require specialized lift bags to counteract its mass. The divers maneuvered around the pylon, threading straps beneath the cylinder, their movements cautious and precise. Each time a bag inflated, the water above it bulged slightly, a hint of the hidden labor below. The moment it came free was so subtle he almost missed it. The surface rippled in an unfamiliar pattern, and then the water parted as the top of the cylinder emerged, black and slick with river grime. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, a sound like wind through dry leaves. He had seen it before, but seeing it break the surface made it real in a way nothing else had. The crane's hook descended, its chain clanking softly as it found the straps attached to the lift bags. Slowly, with the deliberation of a creature reluctant to reveal itself, the cylinder rose higher until it hung dripping above the water, a 6-foot length of metal that looked both ordinary and impossibly out of place. The clamps that had bound it to the bridge were still attached, their jaws empty now, a testament to the force required to pry them loose. They lowered it onto a flatbed truck parked on the far side of the cordon, and men in protective gear swarmed around it, erecting temporary barriers to shield it from curious eyes. He caught a last glimpse of its curved body before it disappeared behind metal screens, and felt an unexpected pang of loss, as if the river had given up a secret it had trusted him to keep. The supervisor approached him as the truck prepared to depart, thanking him in a voice that carried both professionalism and genuine relief. He told him that he had done the right thing, that whatever it was better discovered by someone who cared than left to fester unseen. He nodded, unsure how to respond, his mind still anchored to the image of clamps biting into steel beneath dark water. As the convoy pulled away toward an isolated industrial zone, escorted by flashing lights, he stood beneath the bridge and listened to the city resume its rhythm around him. The traffic would return. The rain would wash away the chalk marks on the pavement, and most people would forget that anything unusual had happened there. But he would not forget the way his scraper had struck metal that day, or the realization that his quiet mission to clean a neglected river had intersected with something far larger, something that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for a moment of contact to pull an ordinary man into its orbit. The bridge looked different the morning after the cylinder was taken away, as if it had been stripped of a layer of innocence that no one had known it possessed. He returned to the riverbank out of habit, though he had no intention of diving. The path was still scarred by tire tracks from the heavy vehicles that had crowded the area the night before, and scraps of barrier tape fluttered weakly from the railings, forgotten in the rush of the operation. The river itself appeared unchanged, carrying the same refuse, the same slow indifference, yet he could no longer see it as a mere conduit for waste. Somewhere beneath its surface, the outline of absence lingered where the cylinder had been, like the negative image left on the eye after a flash of light. His phone vibrated constantly in his pocket. Messages poured in from followers who had watched live streams and shaky clips of the extraction, from reporters who had found his name through anonymous tips, from people he did not know who suddenly wanted to tell him that he was brave or reckless or both. He ignored most of them, replying only to his mother to reassure her that he was unharmed. It felt wrong to bask in attention while the true story of what he had found remained sealed behind official language and portable walls. Later that day, he was asked to return to the site to clarify details of the discovery. The bridge was closed again, this time with an air of finality that left no room for curiosity seekers. Concrete barriers blocked every entrance, and officers directed traffic with crisp gestures that brooked no argument. The detours sent cars snarling through side streets, horns blaring in protest, but the complaints were lost against the machinery of a decision already made. He passed through 2 separate checkpoints before reaching the command post that had been erected beneath the central span. It was larger now, a small city of tents, vehicles, and generators humming in disciplined harmony. He was greeted by a woman in a dark jacket who introduced herself with a clipped nod and asked him to recount everything he had seen once more, this time for the record. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, aware that the casual descriptions he had given the night before were now evidence. The questions came in waves. They wanted to know how long he had been cleaning the river, how often he dove near that particular pylon, whether he had ever noticed anyone working under the bridge at odd hours. He searched his memory for anything that stood out. The faint glow of a boat's navigation lights late at night, the echo of a splash that had not been his own. He could offer nothing definitive, only a series of maybes and impressions that left him feeling inadequate in the face of their meticulous process. Outside, the operation expanded like a living organism. More divers arrived, their trucks lined up in a precise row along the cordoned street. They moved in and out of the river in rotating shifts scanning not just the pylon where the cylinder had been found, but every support along the length of the bridge. He watched from behind a line of tape as they disappeared into the opaque water, wondering if they too felt the strange mixture of fear and curiosity that had seized him the moment he had touched the metal. As the hours passed, he overheard fragments of conversation that hinted at the complexity of the task. The bridge was not a single structure, but a series of interlocking components, each with its own cavities and blind spots. Any one of them could conceal something if a person knew where to look. The thought unsettled him. He had always believed that his dives were a form of surveillance as much as sanitation, that by being present he reduced the unknown. Now he realized how much could hide beyond the reach of a single torch. By mid-afternoon, the air around the command post was thick with the smell of wet concrete and diesel fuel. Technicians wheeled out racks of equipment that resembled something from a science fiction set, screens flickering with sonar images that rendered the riverbed in ghostly monochrome. He was ushered inside a tent to view some of the data, not because he could interpret it better than anyone else, but because his familiarity with the physical space made his perspective valuable. He leaned over a table scattered with printouts, tracing the outlines of the pylons with his finger as he explained where he usually encountered the strongest currents and where debris tended to accumulate. At one point, a diver emerged from the water holding a twisted length of metal that had once been another clamp, its jaws still bearing the imprint of whatever they had gripped. The room fell quiet as it was placed on a tarp, the implication heavy in the air. This was not a one-off mistake. This was part of a system. The bridge remained closed for days. Each morning, he woke to the sound of traffic rerouted past his apartment, the detours turning his street into a makeshift artery. The inconvenience bred resentment among neighbors, and he found himself avoiding eye contact when he went out for groceries, unsure whether people saw him as the cause of their frustration. Online, the narrative had already begun to fracture. Some hailed him as a civic hero. Others accused him of exaggerating the danger to inflate his own profile. He tried not to read the comments, but the knowledge that his quiet project had become a point of contention weighed on him. On the third day, he was invited to accompany a small group of officials to the industrial yard where the cylinder had been taken. The facility lay on the outskirts of the city, a sprawl of warehouses and rusted cranes where the river met the port. The drive there took him through neighborhoods he rarely visited, places where the city seemed to have given up trying to be anything other than functional. The gates opened at the sight of the convoy, and he felt a prickle of unease as they passed into a zone that existed outside the ordinary rhythms of urban life. The cylinder lay in the center of a fenced enclosure, its surface cleaned of most of the river grime. Up close, it looked less like a weapon and more like a piece of industrial equipment, the kind of thing that might be bolted to the hull of a ship or the side of a factory. Yet, the care with which it had been isolated, the presence of men in protective suits and masks, told a different story. He was not allowed to approach it, but from a distance he could see the thickness of its casing and the precise alignment of its seams. A technician briefed them on the preliminary scans. There were no signs of explosives, no internal wiring that suggested an imminent threat, but the density readings indicated that the interior was not empty. Something was packed inside, something that had required a container built to withstand pressure and corrosion. He felt the familiar rush of anticipation that accompanied any discovery, tempered now by the knowledge that he had no control over what would happen next. They did not open it that day. Instead, they spent hours discussing the safest method of access, the possible risks associated with cutting into a sealed metal body that had spent an unknown amount of time underwater. He listened from the periphery, catching words like contamination and chain of custody, concepts that had no place in his previous dives but now defined the trajectory of the story. When he finally returned home, exhausted by the accumulation of small, tense moments, the bridge was still dark against the evening sky. The detours remained, the barriers unmoved. He stood on his balcony and looked toward the river, trying to imagine the gap beneath the central span where the cylinder had been, the empty clamps waiting like jaws frozen mid-bite. For the first time since he had begun cleaning the river, he felt the weight of what he could not see more acutely than the satisfaction of what he had removed. The bridge had closed not just to traffic but to his former certainty, sealing him into a new understanding of the place he thought he knew so well. The industrial yard had a way of making time feel heavier. There were no shop windows here, no cafes, no children darting across crosswalks. Everything was metal and concrete, and the low thunder of machines that never fully went silent. When he arrived the morning the cylinder was finally to be opened, a pale fog clung to the ground as if the river itself had followed the convoy inland and refused to let go. He was escorted through the gates by a uniformed guard who checked his identification twice before nodding him through, his expression neutral but not unkind. By now, he was used to being treated as both witness and potential liability, someone who mattered just enough to be present and just enough to be kept at a distance. The enclosure where the object lay had been transformed overnight. Additional fencing had been erected, and warning signs flapped in the breeze, their bold lettering stark against the muted colors of the yard. Men and women in protective gear moved deliberately around the perimeter, consulting tablets and clipboards, their faces hidden behind visors that reflected the gray sky. The cylinder rested on a cradle of steel supports, elevated so that its underside was visible, its smooth body marked with faint scars where tools had probed it. Seeing it like this, clean and inert, stripped of the mystery the river had lent it, unsettled him in a way he could not explain. It was as if a wild animal had been trapped and tamed, only to reveal that its true danger lay not in its teeth, but in what it carried inside. He was ushered to a viewing area demarcated by a line of portable barriers. From there, he could see the entire scene without being close enough to interfere. The air smelled faintly of ozone and oil, the byproduct of machinery warming up. Somewhere behind him, generators hummed, providing power to equipment that seemed excessive for something as simple as cutting open a piece of metal. Yet nothing about this situation was simple anymore. A technician stepped forward to address the small group of officials and observers gathered near the enclosure. His voice carried through a handheld amplifier, precise and devoid of drama. He explained that scans had confirmed the absence of explosives and volatile gases, but that the interior contents remained unknown. The cylinder had been sealed with a level of craftsmanship that suggested it was designed to protect whatever lay inside from water intrusion for extended periods. The plan was to make a controlled incision along one of the seams, minimizing the risk of damaging the contents while allowing access. As the briefing ended, the technicians took their positions. One of them approached the cylinder, carrying a cutting torch connected to a tangle of hoses that snaked across the concrete like brightly colored veins. Another adjusted a set of clamps that held the cylinder steady, ensuring that it would not shift when the metal began to give way. Everyone else retreated a few steps, and a hush fell over the yard, broken only by the restless murmur of machinery. He felt his pulse quicken, a reflex he recognized from the moments before a difficult dive. Back then, the water had been his adversary, an environment that punished hesitation. Here, the danger was invisible, abstract, and yet it pressed on him with the same insistence. He found himself leaning forward, as if proximity could somehow grant him clarity. The torch flared to life with a hiss that cut through the quiet. A tongue of blue-white flame touched the cylinder's surface, and sparks erupted in a sudden, dazzling cascade. The sound was harsh and intimate, the metal protesting in a shrill whine as it yielded to heat. The technician moved with careful precision, tracing the planned line of incision while another monitored the temperature readings on a handheld device. The smell of scorched steel filled the air, sharp and unmistakable. It carried him back to the bridge, to the faint metallic tang he had noticed underwater, the hint of grease that had clung to his glove. He wondered how long the cylinder had been there, how many seasons of rain and drought had passed over it as it waited, silent and unseen. The cut progressed slowly. Every few inches the technician paused, allowing the metal to cool, checking the integrity of the opening with a probe. Each pause stretched the tension, drawing out the moment that everyone had gathered to witness. The crowd behind the barriers shifted, boots scraping on concrete, cameras raised and lowered as if unsure when the story would finally reveal itself. When the first segment of casing separated from the body, it did not fall away dramatically. It sagged, held in place by a few stubborn points of resistance before being pried loose by a gloved hand. The interior of the cylinder lay just beyond, still mostly obscured by shadow. A collective intake of breath rippled through the onlookers, a sound like the wind rising through tall grass. A portable light was wheeled forward and angled into the opening. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a surface that was not the hollow emptiness some had expected, but a series of tightly packed forms. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The shapes were uniform, wrapped in layers of material that caught the light with a dull sheen. They were arranged with a care that bordered on reverence, each one nestled against the next in a pattern that left no wasted space. A murmur broke the silence, voices overlapping in disbelief. The technician leaned closer, his movements cautious now, and reached inside with a tool designed to grip without puncturing. He drew out the nearest package and held it up for inspection. It was a rectangular brick, its edges crisp, its surface sealed beneath multiple layers of waterproof film. Even from a distance, he could tell that this was no random assortment of cargo. This was inventory. The officials converged on the opening, their earlier restraint forgotten in the face of tangible discovery. Tests were performed on the spot, small devices pressed against the surface of the brick, reagents dabbed and observed. The technician announced the results in a voice that was still professional but tinged with awe. The substance inside was of exceptional purity, far beyond what typically surfaced in street-level seizures. He stood rooted to the concrete, the implications crashing over him in waves. The cylinder he had brushed against in the river was not just a mysterious object. It was a vessel for wealth measured not in dollars, but in the power to reshape lives, to corrupt systems, to leave trails of damage that extended far beyond the banks of the river he had tried to heal. The opening continued, the torch biting deeper into the casing to reveal more of the contents. Brick after brick came into view, hundreds of them stacked with the precision of a master builder. Each one was identical to the last, a testament to the scale and organization of the operation that had placed them there. The enclosure buzzed with activity as evidence bags were prepared and cameras documented every angle. He found himself thinking of the clamps beneath the bridge, the way they had gripped the beam with unwavering force. Those clamps were no longer just pieces of metal in his memory. They were symbols of intent, of a plan designed to exploit the blind spots of a city that preferred to look elsewhere. The river had not been a dumping ground in this instance. It had been a hiding place. As the last section of casing was removed and the full extent of the cargo became clear, the tone in the yard shifted decisively. What had begun as a cautious investigation now stood revealed as a major criminal discovery. Conversations turned from safety protocols to jurisdiction, from technical concerns to the logistics of securing such a massive seizure. He caught snippets of numbers that made his head spin, valuations that dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. When it was over, when the cylinder lay gutted on its steel cradle and the bricks were arrayed in neat rows on tarps for cataloging, he felt an unexpected hollowness. The mystery that had gnawed at him since the moment of discovery had been replaced by a stark reality, one that offered answers but no comfort. The river he loved had been used as a conduit for harm on a scale that dwarfed his efforts, and he could not shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of something far larger. He left the yard that afternoon with the sound of torches still ringing in his ears, and the image of those uniform packages burned into his mind. The bridge would reopen eventually, the detours lifted, the city allowed to forget the disruption. But for him, the opening of that cylinder marked the end of an era of innocence. He had gone looking for trash and found a secret that would not let him go, a revelation that bound his small, stubborn mission to a world of hidden currents he was only beginning to understand. The industrial yard did not empty when the cylinder was opened. If anything, it seemed to grow more crowded, as though the discovery had released a signal that drew people from every corner of the city's hidden bureaucracy. Vans arrived without markings. Men and women stepped out carrying sealed cases and clipboards, and the perimeter expanded once more, fencing sliding outward like a living thing that refused to be contained. He stood at the edge of it all, watching the bricks being counted and catalogued, their sterile packaging contrasting sharply with the filth they had emerged from. The river had been a disguise, nothing more than a layer of grime over a mechanism of astonishing precision. At first, the officials spoke cautiously, using language that kept the scale of the fine deliberately vague. He could hear the discipline in their voices, the instinct to shield the public from panic until the facts were beyond dispute. But the facts were already beginning to speak for themselves. The technicians laid the bricks out in long, orderly lines, each one assigned a number, each one photographed from multiple angles before being sealed into evidence bags that bore the insignia of agencies he had only ever seen in television dramas. It was not the presence of drugs that shocked him, though the word echoed through the enclosure in murmured disbelief. It was the way the entire operation unfolded as if rehearsed, as if everyone involved had known, deep down, that the cylinder was never meant to be empty. He drifted closer to a table where a group of analysts were comparing notes, careful to remain within the boundaries of what he was permitted to observe. One of them, a young woman with her hair pulled into a severe knot, glanced up and met his eyes for a moment before returning to her work. In that fleeting exchange, he saw a mixture of fascination and dread that mirrored his own. Whatever lay beneath the bridge was not an isolated crime. It was a node in a network, a point of intersection where invisible lines converged. Later that evening, he was called into a temporary office that had been set up in one of the yard's prefabricated buildings. The walls were thin, their hollow interiors amplifying every footstep outside, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. A man introduced himself as part of a federal task force, his tone polite but distant, and began to explain what they believed the cylinder represented. It was not a bomb, not a random stash, but a purpose-built container designed to be attached to infrastructure that no one thought to inspect from below. Its shape was no accident. The smooth, tapered body reduced drag in the water, allowing it to remain stable even in strong currents. The clamps that had held it to the beam were industrial grade, sourced from suppliers who specialized in maritime equipment. Everything about it spoke of planning, of people who had studied the habits of the city as closely as he had studied the river's eddies. The task force believed that the bridge was being used as a temporary storage point, a place to hide high-value cargo until the conditions were right to retrieve it. Boats could slip in at night. Divers unhook the container or remove its contents and vanish before dawn, leaving no trace visible to anyone who was not actively searching beneath the surface. The sheer audacity of it made his head spin. He had spent years thinking of the river as a neglected artery of the city, forgotten by planners and politicians alike. Now he understood that its neglect had made it valuable, a blind spot ripe for exploitation. As he left the office, the sky had darkened, and the yard was lit by harsh floodlights that cast long shadows across the concrete. The bricks were gone, transferred to secure facilities for further analysis, but the gutted cylinder remained, its hollow shell an empty testament to the sophistication of the scheme. He paused beside it, running his fingers just above the metal without quite touching it, as if the cold might leap into him and carry some remnant of its secret. Over the next few days, fragments of the investigation filtered back to him through conversations he was not supposed to hear and articles that appeared online before being quietly revised. Authorities had begun inspecting other bridges along the river, sending divers into the water at sites that had never warranted such attention. The results were not made public, but the mood among the officials he encountered shifted perceptibly from surprise to grim resolve. This was no longer about one container. It was about the realization that the city's understructure had been co-opted by forces that understood its vulnerabilities better than its guardians ever had. He returned to the river, not to dive but to stand on the bank and watch. The bridge was still closed, its absence from the city's daily rhythm now a permanent background to the unfolding story. He tried to imagine the work that must have gone into placing the cylinder where he had found it. The divers would have needed to move with confidence in that dark, turbulent water, navigating the same hazards he faced with the added burden of secrecy. They would have arrived at night, likely when the city slept, their tools muffled, their lights hidden beneath the surface. Someone would have held the clamps steady while another tightened them, each turn of the wrench an act of quiet defiance against a system that assumed its foundations were secure. He thought of the cables and ties he had found in the months before the discovery, the small clues he had dismissed as anomalies. In hindsight, they took on a new meaning, fragments of a larger pattern that had been there all along. He wondered how many times he had swum past similar installations without recognizing them, how many secrets he had brushed with his gloves only to move on in search of the next piece of trash. The idea that the bridge was just one node in a larger web gnawed at him. If the task force was correct, then there were likely other caches hidden in other blind spots, perhaps even in other cities. The ingenuity of the scheme lay not only in its execution, but in its exploitation of human nature. People did not look down. They did not consider what lay beneath their feet as they hurried across familiar routes. Infrastructure was meant to be invisible, a silent servant that faded into the background. The criminals who had installed the cylinder had weaponized that invisibility, turning it into a shield. At home, the river no longer offered him solace. He lay awake at night, listening to the detoured traffic outside his window, the horns and engines forming a restless symphony that mirrored his thoughts. He replayed the moment of discovery again and again, trying to pinpoint the instant when his life had veered onto this new, disquieting path. It had been so ordinary, the scrape of metal against his tool, a sensation indistinguishable from the dozens of other contacts he had made beneath the bridge. How many turning points were like that, he wondered, disguised as trivialities until they were revealed as fault lines. Friends and neighbors began to treat him differently. Some offered congratulations, as if he had won a prize rather than stumbled into a criminal operation. Others asked pointed questions about what else he had seen down there, their curiosity tinged with a nervousness they tried to hide. He answered as best he could, careful not to speculate beyond what he knew, but the act of speaking about it all made him feel as though he were still underwater, groping for shapes in the dark. One afternoon, he was invited to attend a briefing at a downtown office, a place far removed from the grime of the industrial yard. The room was sleek and modern, glass walls offering a panoramic view of the skyline that contrasted jarringly with the subject at hand. Officials presented slides showing diagrams of the cylinder's construction, charts mapping the river's flow, and maps highlighting other potential sites of interest. He sat in the back, absorbing the information with a sense of unreality. This was the same river he had waded into as a child, the same bridge he had crossed countless times without a second thought, now reduced to data points in a criminal analysis. The briefing concluded with a warning that the investigation was ongoing and that details would be restricted to protect its integrity. He was thanked again for his role, this time with a formality that bordered on ceremonial. As he left the building, the city unfolded before him in all its layered complexity, a place of cafes and office towers and tree-lined streets that concealed, beneath its surface, currents of activity no one had ever taught him to see. That evening, he walked back to the bridge, stopping at the barriers that still blocked its entrance. The river flowed beneath it, as it always had, indifferent to the attention it had drawn. He leaned on the railing and peered into the water, trying to imagine the container as it had once been, clamped to the beam like an uninvited guest who had made himself comfortable. The emptiness he saw now was not reassuring. It was an absence that spoke of possibility, of spaces that could be filled again if no one was watching. He understood, then, that the story was no longer about what had been found, but about what remained hidden. The cache beneath the city had been exposed, but the city itself, with its forgotten corners and neglected depths, still harbored untold secrets, and he, who had only ever wanted to pull garbage from a river, had become a witness to a world that thrived precisely because no one else bothered to look. The city changed its posture after the briefing. It was not something most residents could articulate, yet it was palpable in the way police cruisers lingered near river access points, in the temporary fencing that sprouted along embankments that had once been open to joggers and dog walkers. For him, the shift was deeply personal. The river that had been his refuge now felt like the front line of a conflict he had never volunteered to join, and every glance toward its murky surface carried with it a question that refused to settle. What else was hidden there, and who had been relying on that concealment for so long? The task force contacted him repeatedly in the days that followed, their questions growing more granular with each call. They wanted to reconstruct not only the moment he found the cylinder, but the months that had preceded it. He sat at his kitchen table with a stack of his old notebooks spread before him, their pages warped by moisture, and walked them through his routines. He described the way he divided the riverbed into informal sectors, the spots where currents were strong enough to clear away sediment, and the hollows where debris collected. He pointed out the entries in his notes where he had mentioned odd finds, the pieces of cable that had seemed out of place, the sections of water he had avoided because something about them had made his instincts tighten. They listened without interrupting, their pens moving steadily across legal pads. He could tell they were mapping his words onto a larger framework, testing his memories against sonar images and maintenance records that he would never be allowed to see. When they asked about nights he might have noticed activity under the bridge, he closed his eyes and tried to summon images that were not already distorted by hindsight. He remembered the low whine of boat engines drifting across the water after midnight, the brief flicker of a light near the central pylon that he had dismissed as a fisherman. Those memories took on a different weight now, as if they had been waiting for this context to reveal their significance. The investigation widened like a lens being adjusted. Divers were dispatched not only to his bridge, but to every structure that crossed the river within a 10-mile radius. He did not accompany them, though he longed to, understanding all too well that his presence would complicate rather than help. Instead, he followed the progress through conversations and carefully worded statements that appeared in the local news. Officials spoke of routine inspections and precautionary measures, but he caught the tension beneath the phrasing, the urgency that no amount of bureaucratic polish could hide. One evening, he received a call from a number he did not recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, almost friendly, yet it carried a cadence that made his shoulders tense. The caller asked whether he had noticed anyone lingering near his apartment recently, whether any unfamiliar vehicles had been parked on his street. The questions were framed as a courtesy, a way of ensuring his safety, but the implication was clear. The people who had installed the cylinder had not done so out of carelessness, and it would be naive to assume that they were unaware of its disappearance. That night, he stood on his balcony long after the city lights had come on, scanning the street below for patterns that had never concerned him before. Every idling engine sounded suspicious, every pedestrian an enigma. He felt foolish and exposed in equal measure, as though the river had washed away a layer of protection he had not known he possessed. When he finally went to bed, sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams in which he swam through endless tunnels of concrete, each one opening onto another hidden chamber. The task force requested that he limit his public presence. His videos, once a weekly chronicle of trash removal and modest triumphs, went dark without explanation. Followers speculated wildly, filling the silence with theories that ranged from the flattering to the absurd. He resisted the urge to correct them, knowing that any statement he made could be twisted into a narrative that served someone else's purpose. It was a strange reversal to be asked to stop shining light into the darkness just as he had learned how vital that light could be. The bridge inspections yielded results, though few details were shared with him directly. He learned through a contact that additional clamps had been found beneath another span downstream, their metal jaws still warm with recent disturbance. There was talk of similar devices being reported in other cities, whispers that suggested the scheme was neither local nor new. The word network began to surface in conversations, spoken with a caution that betrayed its weight. He imagined lines stretching from bridge to bridge, from river to river, connecting places that had never considered themselves part of the same story. Amid this expansion, his own role became increasingly ambiguous. He was no longer just a witness but a reference point, the variable that had disrupted a process designed to operate unseen. When he was invited to meet with analysts in a downtown office, the atmosphere was different from the earlier briefings. there was a sense of urgency now, of a clock ticking somewhere beyond the walls. They asked him to help identify patterns in the locations where he had found odd materials, overlaying his recollections onto digital maps that pulsed with layers of data. He pointed to bends in the river where currents slowed, to stretches of bank shielded from view by overhanging trees or industrial fencing, and watched as the analysts nodded, their screens adjusting to incorporate his instincts. In quieter moments, he wondered what the people behind the scheme were thinking. Had they noticed the sudden flurry of activity along the river, the divers descending into waters they had once claimed as their own? Were they scrambling to dismantle other caches, or had they already written off this city as compromised? The thought that his simple act of cleaning had triggered a cascade of consequences both thrilled and terrified him. The pressure seeped into his daily life in subtle ways. Friends who had once dropped by unannounced now texted first, as if afraid to bring uninvited attention to his door. His mother called more often, her concern masked by banal questions about his health and the weather. Even the grocery clerk down the street, who had never known his name, smiled at him with a recognition that felt unearned and unwanted. One afternoon, as he was returning from a meeting, he noticed a sedan idling across the street from his building. It was unremarkable in every way, the kind of car that blended seamlessly into traffic, yet it was gone when he emerged from his stairwell minutes later. He told himself not to read into it, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. That evening, he moved his spare diving gear out of sight, stacking the tanks in a corner of his closet rather than leaving them by the door as he used to. The river was off limits for now, but old habits died hard. The task force eventually informed him that his assistance would no longer be required on a daily basis. The investigation had grown beyond the scope of what he could reasonably contribute, branching into jurisdictions and methods he had never encountered. He felt both relief and loss at the news, as though he were being gently escorted from a room where history was unfolding, back into a life that suddenly seemed smaller by comparison. Yet the investigation did not release him entirely. He remained a point of contact, a name in a file that could be summoned if new information surfaced. He tried to return to routines that had once defined him, to the gym, to evenings spent reading instead of scrolling through headlines. But the river was always there, a presence at the edge of his vision, carrying with it the knowledge that beneath its surface, in places he had not yet mapped, the remnants of someone else's ambition might still be waiting. On the night he finally slept without dreaming of tunnels and clamps, he awoke before dawn and stood by the window, watching the first light creep over the rooftops. The detours around the bridge had been lifted, the traffic flowing once more along its familiar path. To most of the city, the disruption was already fading into memory, another inconvenience filed away beneath more pressing concerns. He alone felt the full weight of what remained unresolved. The investigation had opened doors he could not close, revealing how easily the overlooked could be transformed into the indispensable. He had cleaned a river, and in doing so had uncovered a shadow economy that thrived on neglect. As he turned away from the window and prepared for a day that promised no answers, he carried with him the uneasy certainty that the water he loved was still holding secrets, and that somewhere someone was calculating the cost of having been seen. When the bridge finally reopened, there were no ceremonies, no speeches, not even a ribbon to be cut. The barriers were simply rolled aside in the pale light of a Monday morning, and the city flowed back into the gap it had learned to live without. Drivers crossed the span with the same impatience as always, their minds already fixed on meetings and errands, unaware that for a brief span of weeks, the structure beneath their tires had been the epicenter of a story that reached far beyond its concrete ribs. For most of them, the detours were an inconvenience that had ended. For him, the reopening marked something else entirely, a quiet return to normality that felt almost unnatural after everything he had seen. He walked to the river that afternoon, not with tanks slung over his shoulder, but with empty hands, the way he had done as a child. The water was lower now, the storms of early summer having passed, and the current moved lazily between the pylons. From the surface, there was no hint of what had been found there, no scar to indicate the removal of the cylinder, only the usual constellation of floating debris catching the light. He leaned against the railing and closed his eyes, listening to the rumble of cars overhead, a sound that had once been background noise and now felt like a reminder of how easily people passed over the hidden layers of their own world. The investigation had not ended with the reopening of the bridge. It had simply retreated from public view, folding itself into the quiet channels where law enforcement did its most consequential work. He received occasional updates in the form of carefully worded emails that thanked him for his continued cooperation and informed him that further developments could not be shared at this time. He learned to read between the lines, to recognize when phrases like significant progress and expanding scope hinted at a story far larger than any single cache beneath a bridge. Life, in the meantime, demanded to be lived. His job resumed its familiar rhythms, the small frustrations and minor triumphs of ordinary workdays reasserting themselves. Friends who had tiptoed around him in the aftermath of the discovery began to relax, their conversations drifting back to safer topics. His mother stopped calling twice a day, reassured at last that whatever danger he had brushed against had not followed him home. The city, too, moved on, its collective attention shifting to the next headline, the next outrage or celebration to claim its fleeting focus. Yet the river refused to become invisible again. Each time he passed it, he felt the pull of unfinished business, the knowledge that beneath the surface lay more than broken bottles and forgotten shopping carts. He had been shown a dimension of the city that most people would never see, and the experience had changed him in ways he could not fully articulate. He was no longer content to believe that neglect was merely a sign of decay. He understood now that it could be a strategy, an invitation extended to anyone willing to exploit it. It was in this altered state of awareness that he began to notice things others missed. A pattern of tire tracks near a secluded boat ramp that appeared and vanished with suspicious regularity. A stretch of bank where the undergrowth had been trampled in a way that did not align with recreational use. None of it was enough to warrant action on its own, but taken together it formed a constellation of possibility that made his skin prickle. He mentioned these observations to his contact at the task force, careful not to overstate their importance, and was met with polite acknowledgments that left him uncertain whether he had been heard or simply logged. One evening, weeks after the bridge had reopened, he received a message from an unfamiliar number. It contained no greeting, only a grainy photograph of the river taken from a vantage point he recognized instantly. The angle was wrong for a casual snapshot, too focused on a particular pylon, and the timestamp indicated it had been taken in the early hours of the morning. There was no threat, no explanation, yet the implication was unmistakable. Someone else was watching the water. He did not respond. Instead, he forwarded the image to the task force and waited. The reply came hours later, a terse assurance that they were aware of renewed activity in the area and that he should prioritize his safety above all else. It was not the reassurance he had hoped for. The idea that the river was once again a site of interest to people who thrived on secrecy left him with a hollow feeling in his chest. Despite this, he found himself drawn back to his old routines, albeit in a different form. He volunteered with a local environmental group, helping to organize surface cleanups and educational workshops that encouraged residents to take ownership of their waterways. Standing in front of a classroom of restless teenagers, he spoke not of drug caches or criminal networks, but of stewardship, of the simple power of paying attention. He did not tell them what he had found under the bridge, yet his words carried the weight of that knowledge, the conviction that unseen spaces mattered precisely because they were unseen. His videos never fully resumed their previous cadence. When he did post, the clips were quieter, more reflective, focusing on the slow work of restoration rather than the thrill of discovery. Viewers noticed the change, some praising his maturity, others lamenting the loss of drama. He accepted both reactions with equal calm. The river had taught him that spectacle was fleeting, but consequence endured. The task force eventually closed his file, at least officially. He was thanked one last time for his contribution, assured that his actions had played a role in dismantling a significant criminal operation. The words brought little comfort. He knew too much now to believe in finality. Somewhere, someone was adapting, learning from the mistake of being discovered beneath a bridge that had seemed the perfect hiding place. On a crisp autumn morning, months after the cylinder had been opened, he returned to the central pylon for the first time since the bridge had reopened. He did not dive. He sat on the bank and watched the water slide past, the reflections of clouds drifting across its surface. At low tide, when the river receded enough to reveal the scarred concrete at its edges, he noticed something that made him lean closer. A faint discoloration on the underside of a beam, just visible through the shallows, a pattern that mirrored the imprint of a clamp. It could have been anything, a trick of light, the remnant of some unrelated repair. Yet the sight of it sent a familiar chill through him. He stood and took a photograph, careful to include the surrounding landmarks, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. The act was instinctive now, less a response to fear than to responsibility. As he walked away from the river, the city opened before him in all its layered complexity, a place of ordinary lives built atop extraordinary secrets. He did not feel like a hero, unexpected or otherwise. He felt like a man who had learned to look where others did not, and in doing so had altered the trajectory of something far larger than himself. The bridge carried traffic as it always had. The river carried its burden of debris, and the world continued to spin, unaware of the fragile thread that connected the visible to the hidden. He knew that he would never again slip beneath the surface with the same innocence he had once possessed. Every dive, every glance into dark water would carry with it the memory of that smooth metal curve and the revelation it had contained. Yet he also knew that he could not stop looking. The city had shown him its blind spots, and in those blind spots he had found a purpose that transcended the simple act of cleaning trash from a river. It was a purpose born not of recognition or acclaim, but of vigilance. The quiet, stubborn insistence on seeing what lay beneath the surface and refusing, ever again, to pretend that it was not there. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what we uncover next. Watch our other investigations and dive deeper into stories you won't see anywhere else. And if this discovery shocked you, share this video with your friends so they can see it too.